The prestigious law firm of Henderson and Associates stood tall in downtown Manhattan, its glass windows reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of justice. At least, that's what it was supposed to represent. On the 35th floor, Richard Thompson adjusted his perfectly pressed Italian suit, a smirk playing across his face as he prepared for another day of what he considered putting people in their place. At 45 years old, Thompson had built his reputation as one of New York's most ruthless defense attorneys. His success rate was impressive, but those who knew him well understood that his victories often came at the cost of his humanity. His corner office, decorated with expensive art and leather furniture, spoke of his material success, but the cold gleam in his eyes told a different story. That morning, Thompson was scheduled to meet with a potential client accused of corporate fraud. As he waited in the lobby of his firm, his attention was drawn to a woman in a modest business suit who had just stepped off the elevator. She carried a simple briefcase and moved with quiet confidence, her natural hair styled professionally. Without even knowing her purpose there, Thompson's prejudices immediately surfaced. He watched as she approached the reception desk, his lip curling slightly. The woman was asking about the Henderson case, a high-profile corporate lawsuit that Thompson had been eyeing for months. "I'm here for the strategy meeting," she explained to the receptionist. Before the receptionist could respond, Thompson strode over, unable to contain himself. "I believe you must be lost," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The paralegal orientation is on the 20th floor." He made no attempt to hide his disdain, speaking slowly as if addressing someone who might not understand basic English. The woman's expression remained remarkably composed, though something flickered in her eyes. Rather than responding to his insult, she simply reached into her briefcase and produced her credentials. "Actually, I'm here for the Henderson case," she stated calmly. Thompson let out a derisive laugh that drew attention from others in the lobby. "Listen, I don't know who let you up here, but the Henderson case is one of our biggest corporate lawsuits. It requires extensive experience in corporate law and an understanding of complex financial regulations. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with simpler cases?" The woman tucked her credentials back into her briefcase, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "I appreciate your concern about my qualifications," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "However, I'm not here to apply for a position or seek your approval." Thompson's face reddened slightly, his arrogance preventing him from reading the warning signs in her calm demeanor. "Well, I'm the leading attorney on this case, and I can assure you that." "No, Mr. Thompson," she interrupted quietly. "You're not." The elevator doors opened again, and the firm's managing partner stepped out, his face lighting up upon seeing the woman. "Judge Richardson. Thank you so much for coming. I apologize for any confusion at reception." Thompson's face drained of color as realization dawned. The woman he had just attempted to humiliate was not only a judge but had recently been appointed to oversee the Henderson case, the very case he had been boasting about. But more than that, she was known throughout the legal community for her brilliant handling of complex corporate cases and her sterling reputation for fairness and integrity. The managing partner turned to Thompson, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I see you've met Judge Richardson. She's here to discuss the parameters of the case management schedule." He turned back to the judge. "Shall we proceed to the conference room, Your Honor?" Judge Richardson nodded graciously, then paused to look at Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you'll want to attend this meeting as well. After all, we have much to discuss about the appropriate conduct expected in my courtroom." As Thompson followed them down the hallway, his earlier arrogance replaced by mounting dread, he couldn't help but notice how others in the office were looking at him. In just a few minutes, he had revealed his prejudices to everyone present, including the one person who now held considerable power over his professional future. The conference room felt unusually warm to Thompson as he sat rigidly in his chair, watching Judge Richardson command the room with effortless authority. The morning's events had spread through the office like wildfire, and now his colleagues subtly distanced themselves from him, leaving an empty chair on either side. As Judge Richardson outlined the case management schedule, her voice clear and professional, Thompson struggled to focus. His mind kept replaying his behavior in the lobby, each remembered word making him sink lower in his seat. The managing partner's occasional glares in his direction suggested that a very unpleasant conversation awaited him after this meeting. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Richardson said, causing him to snap to attention. "Given your extensive experience with corporate law, I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the proposed discovery timeline." Her tone was perfectly professional, giving no indication of their earlier encounter, which somehow made him feel even worse. He cleared his throat, shuffling through his papers. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the timeline is." He trailed off, realizing he hadn't heard a word of the previous discussion. The silence that followed was deafening. "Perhaps you need a moment to review the documents," Judge Richardson suggested, her voice neutral but her eyes holding his steadily. "In the meantime, let's discuss the motion practice guidelines." As the meeting continued, Thompson became increasingly aware of how his reputation was crumbling around him. He had built his career on intimidation and arrogance, assuming his Harvard degree and family connections would shield him from consequences. Now, sitting in this conference room, he realized how quickly it could all fall apart. After the meeting, Judge Richardson gathered her materials while others filed out. Thompson remained seated, knowing he needed to say something but finding words inadequate. Before he could speak, the managing partner stepped back into the room. "Judge Richardson, please accept my deepest apologies for this morning's incident," he said, shooting Thompson a pointed look. "I assure you it doesn't reflect our firm's values." "Thank you, but I believe Mr. Thompson might have something to say himself," she replied, turning expectantly to Thompson. Standing awkwardly, Thompson felt like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "Your Honor, my behavior was inexcusable. I made assumptions that were." He paused, struggling with words that he had never needed to say before. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Judge Richardson studied him for a moment. "Mr. Thompson, I've been in the legal profession for 25 years. Do you know what I've learned?" She waited until he met her gaze. "The law doesn't care about the color of someone's skin, their gender, or their background. It cares about justice, about facts, about truth. When we let our prejudices cloud our judgment, we fail not just as lawyers, but as human beings." She gathered her briefcase, then added, "The Henderson case begins next week. I expect to see exemplary professionalism from all counsel in my courtroom." "And Mr. Thompson?" She paused at the door. "I suggest you spend some time reflecting on why you felt comfortable making those assumptions about me. Your future appearances in my courtroom will show me whether today was a moment of learning or simply an empty apology." After she left, the managing partner turned to Thompson, his face grave. "The board will need to discuss this incident. Until then, you're suspended from lead counsel duties on the Henderson case." "And Richard?" His voice hardened. "If it were up to me, you'd be clearing out your office right now." Alone in the conference room, Thompson stared out at the city skyline. For the first time in his career, his carefully constructed world was shaking. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues canceling lunch plans. His secretary had already rescheduled his afternoon appointments. Word was spreading, and he knew that in the legal community, reputation was everything. He thought about his own daughter, away at law school, who had always looked up to him as a model of success. What would she think if she knew about today? He remembered her passionate speeches about justice and equality, which he had dismissed as youthful idealism. Now, those words came back to haunt him. As he walked back to his office, he noticed how people avoided his eyes. How conversations stopped when he passed. The corner office that had been his pride now felt like a glass cage, displaying his shame for all to see. On his desk, the Henderson case files sat waiting, but now they represented something different, not just another chance to win, but perhaps his last chance to prove he could change. Judge Richardson's words echoed in his mind: the law cares about justice, about facts, about truth. For the first time in his career, Thompson wondered if he had lost sight of what really mattered in his pursuit of power and prestige. The question now was whether he could find his way back to the principles that had first drawn him to law, or if his prejudices had already cost him everything he'd worked for. The weekend passed in a blur for Thompson as he sat in his home office, surrounded by the Henderson case files. His phone had remained mostly silent, except for a call from his daughter that he'd let go to voicemail, unable to face her usual Sunday check-in. The story of his confrontation with Judge Richardson had spread through New York's legal circles like a virus, and he'd already received several emails from long-term clients reconsidering their legal representation. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. As Thompson walked through the courthouse metal detectors, he noticed the subtle shifts in how people reacted to him. Security guards who used to greet him warmly now simply nodded curtly. Fellow attorneys who once clustered around him in the hallways suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The Henderson case's first hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in courtroom 2B. Thompson, no longer lead counsel but still part of the legal team, slipped into the courtroom early. He chose a seat toward the back of the attorney section, behind his colleagues who had once jockeyed for position near him. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. The Honorable Judge Richardson presiding. Judge Richardson entered the courtroom with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in the law firm's lobby. Her robe seemed to emphasize her authority rather than merely symbolize it. As everyone settled into their seats, her eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Thompson. Good morning, she began. Before we address the Henderson matter, I'd like to establish some ground rules for proceedings in this courtroom. Her voice carried clearly without being loud. In this court, we will evaluate arguments based on their merit, evidence based on its reliability, and attorneys based on their preparation and professionalism. Nothing else will be considered relevant to our proceedings. Thompson felt the weight of several glances in his direction, but kept his eyes forward. The next hour passed in a detailed discussion of procedural matters, with his colleague now handling the arguments he had spent weeks preparing. He found himself listening with new attention, noting how Judge Richardson gave each attorney equal time and consideration, interrupting only to ask incisive questions that cut to the heart of each issue. During a brief recess, Thompson stepped into the courthouse bathroom, splashing water on his face. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The smug confidence that had been his trademark was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. Rough morning? A voice asked. In the mirror, Thompson saw an older black attorney he recognized from previous cases but had never bothered to know by name. The man was washing his hands, watching Thompson with an expression that held neither judgment nor sympathy. I've had better, Thompson admitted. You know, the older attorney said, drying his hands, I've been practicing law in this city for 30 years. Seen a lot of lawyers come and go. The ones who last aren't always the smartest or the most aggressive. They're the ones who learn to see people, really see them. He headed for the door, then paused. It's never too late to start seeing, counselor. Back in the courtroom, Thompson found himself really looking at his surroundings for the first time. He noticed the young paralegal whose research he dismissed without reading because of her accent. The court reporter who'd worked on dozens of his cases but whose name he'd never bothered to learn. The security guard who'd helped him find his missing briefcase last month, whom he'd barely thanked. Judge Richardson's voice brought him back to the present. She was addressing a motion filed by the defense team, one that Thompson had helped prepare before his suspension. As she methodically dismantled their arguments, he realized she was highlighting exactly the flaws he'd noticed but had ignored in his rush to overwhelm the opposition with aggressive tactics. Counsel, she concluded, while your motion shows considerable effort, it fails to address the fundamental issues of equity in this case. I'm denying the motion, but I'll allow you to refile with a more substantive analysis of the fair dealing requirements. Thompson found himself nodding slightly. She was right, they had rushed the motion, counting on overwhelming the opposition with procedural complications rather than addressing the real issues. It was a tactic he'd used successfully many times before, but now it felt hollow. After the hearing, Thompson lingered in the courtroom, watching as Judge Richardson spoke briefly with each attorney who approached her bench. Her interactions were professional but genuine, offering guidance even to those whose arguments she had rejected. He noticed how the younger attorneys, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, seemed to stand taller after speaking with her. As the courtroom emptied, Thompson gathered his courage and approached the bench. Judge Richardson looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "Your Honor," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "I noticed several flaws in our motion that I should have addressed before filing. Would it be appropriate for me to share these observations with my colleagues for their revised submission?" Judge Richardson studied him for a moment. "Mr. Thompson, good legal work isn't about winning at all costs. It's about seeking justice through honest advocacy. If you have insights that could help achieve that goal, I believe you have an ethical obligation to share them." She began gathering her papers, then added, "You know, when I was a young attorney, I had a mentor who told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the law is a tool for justice, but justice requires us to see the humanity in everyone who comes before us." It took me years to fully understand what he meant. As Thompson turned to leave, she spoke again. "Mr. Thompson? Sometimes our greatest professional growth comes from our most uncomfortable moments. What matters is what we choose to do with those moments." Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Thompson pulled out his phone. He had a lot of work to do, starting with returning his daughter's call. But first, he needed to send an email to his team about that motion. For the first time in his career, he was more interested in getting it right than in winning at all costs. That evening, Thompson sat in his daughter's favorite coffee shop, nervously checking his watch every few minutes. After their phone call, she had insisted on meeting in person, cutting her law school study session short to take the train from Yale to New York. The small table felt exposed, and he could sense other patrons occasionally glancing his way. News of his courthouse humiliation had spread even faster than he'd feared. His daughter arrived like a whirlwind, her law books tucked under one arm and her face set in an expression he recognized from her mother, disappointment mixed with determination. She sat down without ordering, fixing him with a direct stare. "Dad, my friend sent me a video of what happened at your firm," she began, her voice tight with emotion. "Someone recorded it on their phone. It's all over the law school forums." Thompson felt his stomach drop. He hadn't known about any video, though he should have expected it in this digital age. "Listen, sweetheart." "No, Dad, you listen," she interrupted, leaning forward. "Do you remember my roommate from freshman year? The one you refused to meet at Parents' Weekend?" She pulled out her phone, showing him a photo. "She's graduating top of our class and just accepted a federal clerkship. But I never told her who my father was because I was ashamed of how you'd react to her being black." The words hit Thompson like physical blows. He'd always told himself his attitudes were about maintaining professional standards, about tradition, about merit. Seeing the pain in his daughter's eyes forced him to confront the uglier truth. "The thing is, Dad," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "I've always looked up to you as a lawyer. You taught me to fight for what I believe in. But somewhere along the way, you stopped fighting for justice and started fighting just to win." Before Thompson could respond, his phone buzzed with an email from the firm. The subject line made his heart skip, "Board decision regarding recent incident." His daughter noticed his expression change. "Is that about your suspension?" she asked. He nodded, staring at the unopened email. The board's decision. Open it, she said firmly. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it together. Thompson took a deep breath and opened the email. As he read, his expression shifted from tension to surprise. The board had decided against termination but had placed him on a 6-month probation. During this period, he would be required to work under supervision and attend mandatory diversity and inclusion training. Additionally, he would need to take on 3 pro bono cases from the firm's community outreach program. They're giving me a chance to prove I can change, he said, looking up at his daughter. The question is, do you want to change? She asked, stirring her coffee. Really change, not just say the right things to save your job. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from one of the junior associates on the Henderson case, an attorney whose name he'd never bothered to learn before this week. The associate had reviewed his suggestions for the motion revision and found additional supporting cases that strengthened their argument about fair dealing requirements. Thank you for taking the time to help us improve the motion, the message read. It's the first time a senior partner has actually explained the reasoning behind their suggestions instead of just demanding changes. Thompson showed the message to his daughter, who read it with raised eyebrows. That doesn't sound like the dad I know, she said, but her tone had warmed slightly. I'm starting to realize I don't want to be the dad you knew, Thompson replied quietly. Or the lawyer I've been. He pulled out his laptop. Look at this. I've been researching Judge Richardson's career. Did you know she established a mentorship program for first-generation law students? Or that she worked pro bono on civil rights cases while building her corporate practice? His daughter watched him with growing interest as he continued. She built her reputation on integrity and excellence, not intimidation. She's everything I've claimed to be but wasn't. And now. He gestured at his laptop. I'm looking at these pro bono cases the firm wants me to take. There's one about a family facing eviction because their apartment building was illegally converted. We could actually help them. We? His daughter asked. Well, I thought maybe, if you're interested, you could help me prepare the cases during your summer break. See what real legal work is like. He hurried on, but I understand if you don't want to be associated with. Dad, she interrupted, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I'd like that. But only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll let this experience actually change you. Not just your behavior in court or at the office, but really change how you see people. All people. Thompson looked at his daughter, seeing for the first time how she had grown into someone wiser than he had been. I promise, he said. And I'd like to meet your roommate. If she's willing. As they continued talking, making plans for the summer cases, Thompson felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the genuine excitement of using his legal skills to help people who needed it. The prestigious corner office and expensive suits suddenly seemed less important than the opportunity to rebuild his relationship with his daughter and his own integrity. Judge Richardson's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes our greatest professional growth comes from our most uncomfortable moments. Sitting in that coffee shop with his daughter, Thompson realized this moment of discomfort might actually be the beginning of his finest hour as both a lawyer and a father. His phone buzzed with a message from his daughter. How's the meeting going? Don't forget to ask about the building's repair history. Her enthusiasm for these cases had been infectious, and her fresh perspective often helped him see angles he might have missed. Mrs. Rodriguez, Thompson said, looking up from his notes, would you happen to have any documentation of repair requests from before the new owner took over? She nodded eagerly, pulling more papers from her bag. I keep everything. The old owner, he was good about repairs. I have all the receipts, all the work orders. As Thompson reviewed the documents, his legal mind began connecting dots. The pattern of neglect wasn't just unethical, it was part of a calculated strategy he recognized from his corporate work. The same techniques he'd once used to pressure small businesses into unfavorable settlements were being used against these families. Later that afternoon, Thompson hurried back to the courthouse for the Henderson case's status conference. As he passed through security, the guard he'd previously ignored greeted him by name. "Good luck in there, Mr. Thompson. Heard you're helping the Rodriguez family, they're good people." Thompson paused, surprised. "You know them?" "My sister lives in that building," the guard explained. "Lot of families there going through the same thing." This brief exchange was still on Thompson's mind as he entered Judge Richardson's courtroom. He found himself seeing the Henderson case differently now. What had started as a straightforward corporate fraud matter now revealed layers of human impact he'd previously ignored. During the conference, Thompson noticed Judge Richardson watching him with subtle interest as he quietly supplied notes to his colleagues rather than trying to dominate the proceedings. When his team cited one of his suggested precedents regarding fair dealing requirements, her slight nod told him she recognized the shift in their approach. After the hearing, Thompson remained behind, organizing his notes, when Judge Richardson addressed him directly. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've taken on some pro bono cases," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Yes, Your Honor. The Rodriguez case and 2 others." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, I've discovered some interesting parallels between their situation and certain aspects of corporate law I'd previously misapplied." Judge Richardson's expression showed genuine interest. "How so?" "Well, the techniques being used against these families, systematic negligence, bureaucratic pressure, selective enforcement, they're essentially the same strategies I once used to force small businesses into unfavorable settlements. But now I'm seeing how these tactics affect real people's lives." "And how does that perspective influence your approach to the Henderson case?" she asked. Thompson straightened his shoulders. "I've been reviewing our previous filings. Some of our aggressive tactics, while legal, weren't necessary for serving justice. I've recommended we amend certain positions, focus more on substantive issues rather than procedural advantages." Judge Richardson gathered her papers, considering his words. "You know, Mr. Thompson, when I first started practicing law, I worked housing cases in the Bronx. Those experiences shaped how I later handled corporate cases. Sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zone to truly understand the impact of our work." As Thompson left the courthouse, he received another text from his daughter, "Found some interesting precedents for the Rodriguez case. Can we review them over dinner?" He smiled, remembering how he used to cancel family dinners for work. Now, these evening strategy sessions with his daughter had become the highlight of his week. They'd talk law, share insights, and occasionally she'd challenge his old assumptions, making him see things from new perspectives. Walking to his car, Thompson passed a small group of protesters outside the courthouse. They were supporting tenants from another building facing similar issues to the Rodriguez family. 2 weeks ago, he would have walked past without a glance. Today, he stopped to pick up one of their flyers, recognizing that understanding these community issues made him a better lawyer, even for his corporate clients. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez. "Mr. Thompson, 2 more families from our building want to join the case. They have similar documentation. I'll meet them tomorrow," he replied without hesitation. "And Mrs. Rodriguez? I think I've found a way to tie your cases together that might interest the housing authority. My daughter noticed something in the ownership records that could help us." As he drove home, Thompson reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The corner office didn't feel like a cage anymore. Instead, it had become a place where he could actually make a difference. His corporate expertise, once used primarily for profit, was now helping families keep their homes while still serving his regular clients more ethically. He thought about the upcoming Henderson case proceedings and the pro bono cases, seeing them not as separate worlds but as interconnected parts of a justice system he was finally learning to serve properly. Judge Richardson's presence in his courtroom no longer filled him with dread but with a determination to demonstrate genuine growth, not for appearances, but because he was beginning to understand what real legal advocacy meant. 1 month into his probation, Thompson stood before Judge Richardson in a packed courtroom. The Henderson case had taken an unexpected turn when his work on the Rodriguez family's housing case revealed a connection he couldn't ignore. The same investment group behind the predatory housing practices was involved in the corporate fraud they were investigating. Your Honor, Thompson addressed the court, his voice steady but humbler than anyone could remember hearing it. In light of new evidence, we request permission to amend our filing to include additional documentation. He could feel the surprise from his colleagues at the defense table. This wasn't part of their planned strategy. Judge Richardson leaned forward slightly. What kind of documentation, Mr. Thompson? During my pro bono work, I discovered a pattern of real estate transactions that directly relates to the financial misrepresentations alleged in this case. Thompson glanced at his former protege, now lead counsel, who gave him a slight nod to continue. The same shell companies used to hide assets in the Henderson case are being used to exploit tenants in multiple residential buildings across the city. The corporate defendants' lawyers burst into objections, but Judge Richardson raised her hand for silence. Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting these cases are related? Yes, Your Honor. The evidence suggests that the fraudulent accounting practices in the Henderson case were designed specifically to hide income from these predatory real estate schemes. Thompson handed a thick folder to the clerk. These documents show how they used the same tactics He paused, swallowing his pride, the same tactics I used to teach other lawyers to use. But this time, I'm choosing to expose them instead of hiding behind them. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Richardson studied the documents carefully, occasionally glancing at Thompson with an unreadable expression. Finally, she spoke. The court will review these documents. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss their admissibility. Outside the courthouse, Thompson found himself surrounded by reporters, but for once, he didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he directed them to speak with tenant advocacy groups who could better explain the human cost of these corporate schemes. His phone rang. It was his daughter. Dad, I just heard what happened in court. Are you okay? That was a huge risk you took. I'm fine, he replied, surprised to find he meant it. For the first time in my career, I feel like I'm doing what I became a lawyer to do. Later that evening, Thompson sat in his office, reviewing case files when a knock at his door surprised him. It was the managing partner, looking unusually approving. Bold move today, Richard. The board's been watching your progress. Your probation review is coming up next week. Thompson nodded, but his attention was drawn to a new email from Mrs. Rodriguez. More families had come forward, strengthening their case. You know, he said slowly, I used to think pro bono work was just for building the firm's image. I never understood it could make us better lawyers for all our clients. The managing partner settled into a chair. The firm's considering expanding our pro bono program. We thought you might be interested in heading the initiative, given your unique perspective now. Thompson looked up, startled. Me? After everything that happened? Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most valuable contributions, the managing partner replied, echoing Judge Richardson's words from weeks ago. Your transformation hasn't gone unnoticed. You're doing some of your best work, and you're mentoring younger attorneys instead of intimidating them. Before Thompson could respond, his phone buzzed with news that would change everything. The Housing Authority had agreed to investigate the Rodriguez building's ownership group based on the evidence he'd gathered. But more significantly, this investigation had triggered interest from the SEC in connection with the Henderson case. The next morning, Thompson arrived early to court, finding Judge Richardson already at her bench, reviewing documents. She looked up as he approached. Your Honor, I know it's unusual to request a moment before proceedings, but there's something I need to say. She gestured for him to continue. When we first met, I revealed the worst of myself. I'd spent years building a career on aggressive tactics and hidden prejudices, never questioning whether winning cases meant achieving justice. He straightened his tie nervously. The past month has taught me that true legal excellence isn't about dominating others, it's about upholding justice for everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Judge Richardson set down her papers. Mr. Thompson, when I became a judge, I made a promise to myself that I would help transform the legal profession into something better than what I experienced as a young attorney. Sometimes that means holding up a mirror to those who need to see themselves clearly. She paused. Your actions in recent weeks suggest you've begun to see yourself, and your role as an attorney, more clearly. The courtroom was beginning to fill, but Thompson had one more thing to say. The Rodriguez case goes to housing court next week. My daughter's helped me prepare it. She has a much better understanding of community impact than I ever did at her age. He smiled slightly. She's teaching me as much as I'm teaching her. Judge Richardson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. It seems you're learning the most valuable lesson in law, Mr. Thompson. Our greatest strength lies not in the power we hold over others, but in the power we have to help others access justice. As the bailiff called the court to order, Thompson returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the documents that would link the Henderson case to the housing violations. He understood now that every legal action had human consequences, and his duty was to ensure those consequences served justice rather than just his client's immediate interests. Looking around the courtroom, he no longer saw a battlefield where he needed to prove his superiority. Instead, he saw a place where truth could prevail and justice could be served, if lawyers chose to be its servants rather than its manipulators. The housing court was a far cry from the polished federal courthouse where the Henderson case was being heard. Thompson sat beside Mrs. Rodriguez and 5 other families, his daughter next to him reviewing last-minute documents. The wooden benches were crowded with community members who had come to support their neighbors. The property management company had sent 3 attorneys from a prestigious firm. Thompson recognized their aggressive tactics as mirrors of his own past behavior. They carried themselves with the same arrogance he had once worn like armor, barely glancing at the families whose lives hung in the balance. All rise, the clerk announced as the housing court judge entered. Thompson had prepared meticulously for this moment, but not in his old way of looking for procedural loopholes. Instead, he had built a case on solid evidence and human impact, drawing direct connections between corporate fraud and community harm. As he presented the family's case, Thompson noticed something had changed in his presentation style. Gone was the theatrical flourish and intimidating stance. Instead, he let the facts and human stories speak for themselves, weaving together documentation of neglect with personal testimonies. His daughter occasionally passed him notes, adding points about community impact he might have previously overlooked. During the opposition's arguments, Thompson watched his daughter's face tighten as the corporate lawyers attempted to dismiss the family's complaints as trivial. He placed a calming hand on her arm, whispering, "Watch how we handle this properly." In his rebuttal, Thompson stood slowly. "Your Honor, my colleagues across the aisle present these issues as simple contract matters. 3 months ago, I would have done the same. But let me show you what these contracts really mean." He presented photographs of children studying by cell phone light because the electricity was unreliable, elderly residents carrying water buckets upstairs because the pipes were left unrepaired. "These aren't just lease violations," he continued. "This is a systematic attempt to drive out long-term residents for profit. And as our evidence shows, it's connected to a larger pattern of corporate fraud currently under investigation in federal court." The housing court judge leaned forward with interest. "Are you referring to the Henderson case before Judge Richardson?" "Yes, Your Honor. The same shell companies hiding assets in that case are being used to conceal ownership and profits here. We've submitted evidence to the SEC, but these families can't wait for that investigation to conclude. They need relief now. During a brief recess, Thompson overheard one of the opposing lawyers mock whisper to another, "Since when does Thompson care about housing court cases?" His daughter started to turn around, but Thompson shook his head. "The best response is doing the job right," he said quietly. When the judge returned, her decision was clear. She granted an immediate injunction requiring repairs and maintenance, appointed a special master to oversee the building's management, and ordered a rent rollback to previous levels. As the families celebrated outside the courtroom, Mrs. Rodriguez hugged Thompson's daughter, then Thompson himself. "You know," she said, wiping away tears, "when you first took our case, people told us not to trust you. They showed us that video from the law firm. But my mother always said God works in mysterious ways." Thompson felt his throat tighten. "Sometimes we need to lose our way to find a better path," he replied. Back at his office that evening, Thompson found an email from Judge Richardson. The SEC had formally joined the Henderson case investigation, citing evidence from the housing court proceedings. But it was the last line of her email that caught his attention: "Your integration of corporate and community law practice is creating a notable precedent. Would you be interested in speaking to my law clerk mentorship program about transformative legal practice?" As he considered the invitation, his phone buzzed with a message from the managing partner: "Board meeting tomorrow. Bring your proposal for the expanded pro bono program." Thompson looked around his corner office, remembering how differently it had felt just months ago. The view of the city was the same, but his perspective had completely changed. On his desk, beside the Henderson case files, sat a framed photo his daughter had given him, a group shot of the Rodriguez family and their neighbors, taken after their housing court victory. The next morning, Thompson stopped at the courthouse before his board meeting. Judge Richardson was hearing motions on another case, and he slipped into the back of the courtroom to watch. A young attorney of color was arguing her first major motion, and Thompson could see the nervous tension in her shoulders that he used to view as weakness. Judge Richardson guided the young lawyer's arguments with the same patience she had shown him, helping her find her strongest points without undermining her confidence. The scene reminded Thompson of his daughter's recent words: "Dad, maybe your biggest contribution won't be the cases you win, but the lawyers you help shape." In that moment, Thompson realized that his transformation wasn't just about personal redemption, it was about contributing to a larger change in the legal profession. Every young lawyer he mentored, every pro bono case he took, every time he chose justice over mere victory, he was helping to build the kind of legal system he wished he had served all along. As he headed to his board meeting, Thompson's phone lit up with a text from his daughter: "Guess what? My roommate is applying for a summer internship at your firm." Thompson smiled, remembering their coffee shop conversation that had helped start his journey of change. He typed back, "Tell her I'd be honored to mentor her myself. After all, I have a lot to learn." 6 months later, Thompson stood in Judge Richardson's courtroom for the final hearing of the Henderson case. The gallery was packed, not just with corporate lawyers, but with community members, including the Rodriguez family and other tenants whose evidence had helped expose the broader scheme of fraud. The scene before him would have been unimaginable half a year ago. His daughter sat in the gallery alongside her roommate, now a summer intern at the firm. Several young associates from diverse backgrounds, whom he now mentored, flanked him at the defense table. The managing partner had given him full autonomy to build a team that reflected his new vision of legal practice. As Judge Richardson entered the courtroom, Thompson reflected on how her presence no longer filled him with anxiety but with a sense of responsibility to uphold the highest standards of justice. The evidence connecting the corporate fraud to the housing schemes had proven devastating to the defendants. Rather than dragging out the proceedings, they had agreed to a comprehensive settlement that went far beyond monetary penalties. "The court has reviewed the proposed settlement agreement," Judge Richardson began. "Before rendering a decision, I'd like to hear from both parties about the community restoration provisions." Thompson rose, adjusting his tie, the same one his daughter had given him after their housing court victory. "Your Honor, the settlement includes not only financial restitution but also concrete commitments to community rehabilitation. The defendants will transfer ownership of affected properties to a community land trust, establish a fund for repairs and maintenance, and implement transparent management practices. He paused, glancing at Mrs. Rodriguez in the gallery. Additionally, they've agreed to create a legal aid fund, administered by an independent board, to provide representation for tenants facing similar situations. This fund will support pro bono programs at multiple firms, ensuring this case's impact extends beyond just these properties. The corporate defendants' new counsel spoke next, outlining their compliance plans. Thompson noticed how different their tone was from the aggressive posturing that had marked the early days of the case. His own transformation had sparked a ripple effect, encouraging other firms to reconsider their approaches. During a brief recess, Thompson overheard two young lawyers discussing the case. "Did you hear?" one whispered. "Thompson's pro bono program has the highest success rate in the city. They say he personally reviews every case." "I heard he's teaching a seminar at the law school next semester," the other replied. "Something about ethical corporate practice and community impact." Judge Richardson's return silenced the whispers. She reviewed the final documents, then looked up at the packed courtroom. "The law is not merely a tool for those with power to maintain their advantage," she began. "It is a mechanism for ensuring justice for all members of our society. This settlement represents a significant step toward that ideal." She signed the order, then added, "This case has demonstrated how corporate law and community advocacy can work together to achieve real justice. The court commends all parties for their work in reaching this resolution." After the hearing, Thompson found himself surrounded by his team, including his daughter and her roommate. The young intern's eyes were shining with excitement. "Mr. Thompson, the way you connected corporate law to community impact, that's exactly why I want to practice law." His daughter squeezed his arm. "Dad, remember when you used to say pro bono work was a distraction from real, legal work?" Thompson chuckled. "I remember a lot of things I used to say. Thankfully, some very wise people helped me see how wrong I was." The managing partner approached their group. "Richard, the board reviewed the pro bono program's first-year results. They've approved your proposal to expand it into a full public interest law division. They want you to head it." Before Thompson could respond, he noticed Judge Richardson preparing to leave. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, making his way to the bench. "Your Honor," he began, but she held up a hand. "Mr. Thompson, when you first appeared in my courtroom, I saw someone who had lost sight of why they became a lawyer. Today, I see someone who's not only found their way back but is helping others find theirs." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "You could have ended my career that day in the lobby. Instead, you gave me an opportunity to change." "Change only works if the person is willing to do the hard work," she replied. "You've done that work, and more importantly, you're helping create systemic change." She gathered her papers. "The legal profession needs more examples of redemption through action, not just words." Later that evening, Thompson hosted a celebration at his home, not the kind of exclusive cocktail party he used to throw, but a genuine gathering that included everyone from senior partners to the Rodriguez family. His daughter had insisted on inviting the courthouse security guard whose sister lived in the building, and Thompson had readily agreed. As he looked around his living room, he saw the future of law he wanted to help build: diverse, inclusive, focused on justice rather than just victory. Mrs. Rodriguez was chatting with a senior partner about community needs. His daughter and her roommate were deep in discussion with young associates about their upcoming cases. The managing partner was taking notes as the security guard explained issues he'd observed in other buildings. Thompson stepped out onto his balcony for a moment of quiet reflection. The city skyline sparkled before him, but now he saw beyond the gleaming corporate towers to the communities that made up the city's heart. His phone buzzed with a message: Judge Richardson had recommended him for a position on the Bar Association's Ethics Committee. He smiled, remembering her words from that first difficult day, "Sometimes our greatest professional growth comes from our most uncomfortable moments." Those moments had led him to lose his arrogance but find his humanity, to give up some power but gain real respect, to step back from the spotlight but have more meaningful impact. As he rejoined the gathering, Thompson overheard his daughter telling someone, "You know, my dad used to say he was a great lawyer. But I think he's only now becoming a good one." And for the first time in his career, that meant more to him than any courtroom victory ever had.